Okay, I'm going to be standing right here because I can't move very far. Morning. All right. If you've been with us for a while, you know we've been in a series here where we're looking again at our values. And sort of each month, we're turning over the value that sort of, or values that sit somewhere in the heart of this community that are both something we hold and also aspire to hold. That's the way I think about values. And so I want to begin by reading the value for this month, and I'll tell you where we're going with it. So here's how it reads. We pursue the free exchange of ideas. This is open inquiry is the value. We pursue the free exchange of ideas, explore the lessons of science, philosophy, and the creative arts, and undertake independent spiritual journeys. What the heck is that? What is an independent spiritual journey? I was reading it as I was preparing for these talks. I like to read the values. Imagine that. And that just struck me. I was like, what do we mean by that? What is an independent spiritual journey? What's the value of that? More than that, what is a spiritual journey? Why do you need one? Don't you have enough to do? So why would we get together each week and somewhere in the foundation of this community, in our heart, we hold this value? What is it? So I want to start the talk by giving you an opportunity to turn to the people you're sitting near. Don't threaten them or anything. Don't scare them. But here's the question. What is a spiritual life? I want to start there. And don't think too much. Just, well, this is what I kind of think a spiritual life is. Or if you want to take it more directly from the quote, what's an independent spiritual journey? Which is another way of sort of saying the same thing in my mind. What's an independent spiritual? What is the spiritual life? I want you to start there. I want to see what kind of conversation can ensue, and then I'll give you sort of my 2 cents on it. Go for it. Okay. I know you've settled the matter. By the way, this is one of the things I love about C3. I mean, I look around and I see all kinds of different people, and I am assuming all kinds of independent spiritual journeys. And I do think it is unique that this is a place where we get together and we can talk about such things, and we can share what it's like to be us, and to honor someone else's experience, and to learn from someone else's experience. So I imagine all kinds of things were being said. Probably, if we had time, there'd be some common themes. But I thought I'd try to put my cards on the table, which is hard to do. Like, what would I say a spiritual life is? I'm going to try to do that at the beginning. You can disagree if you want, but I want to try to say this is what I think, or this is the way I would put it, and then we'll sort of unpack some other avenues. So this is what I came up with. This is hard. Okay. It's something like this. The path one walks in pursuit of meaning. Okay, that's the first thing I came up with. The path one walks in pursuit of meaning. Okay? Here's another way of saying it. The path one walks within the experience of meaning, which is slightly different, but to me it brings out a different nuance. I'll read that again. The path one walks within meaning. The path one walks within the experience of meaning, which is slightly different than the pursuit of. Meaning there's a difference, I suppose, between the experience of meaning and the pursuit of meaning. Correct? I'm trying to say both matter. So that was my first go around. And maybe I should back up and say, I'll give you the technical definition of spiritual, meaning the etymology. It comes from a word in Greek which means wind. Okay? The spiritual life is the wind, a life of wind. Which I know that's very helpful. It's the ancient way of saying mystery. Just like, where does the wind come from? And I know you can watch News 8 or whatever you watch and they can tell you, but I mean it in a symbolic sense. You don't know where it comes from, you don't know where it's going, it's mysterious. It seems to move autonomously, not in your control. Correct? That's probably the most important. It moves autonomously and you have no say. So a spiritual life, in a sense, is your relationship with the autonomous movement of mystery of which you have no control. Be another way of saying it. I gave one more. I can't help it. I said I tried to put my cards on the table and I've already given you 3 different definitions. This was the first image that came to my mind, which it's something like a tuning fork being struck. The spiritual life. Something like a tuning fork. Like a tuning fork has 2 metal bars that come up. And one maybe is inside my being, and the other seems to be outside my being. Something like that. And when it gets struck, I would say that's a spiritual experience. And I don't have much say in that. Really, I'm not like, hey, at 4 o'clock, because I'm be kind of bored this afternoon, after the Lions lose, or whenever they play. Whenever they play, they lose. So, after that, I'd like this tuning fork to be struck. I don't know if it works that way, but let's just say every once in a while, human beings experience a resonance that seems to feel like inner and outer, a conversation. Like, oh. Some of you were even describing going to the symphony yesterday, I think, and something like that was happening in the experience of the symphony. You didn't think it just happened. And the tuning fork was struck. So I'd say a spiritual life is the striking of the tuning fork and, this is my conjunction, the cultivation of being open to such an experience. So I like both. I'm saying you can't control a spiritual experience, but a spiritual life can look like the pursuit of, or the cultivation, or the desire for such strange encounters. Okay, so that's as far as I can go right now. A friend of mine has a blog, and the title of it is Things I Will Disagree With in 3 Years or Less. So that's how I feel about talking about the spiritual life. But it matters. It matters because it's built into our value system, but more than that, I think it just matters in the kind of culture we live in. The pursuit of meaning, the spiritual life, the cultivation of the inner resonance, a life of meaning. I think we're starving in that respect, culturally speaking. So we come to places like this, not because we can deliver the resonant tuning fork, but because we desire to pursue a kind of openness to a certain extent to that kind of experience. And anyway, that's what I want to talk about. And why am I talking about it now? Well, because we decided this was going to be the value for this month. But also, I think there's something about this time of year, Christmas, the holidays, where there's a kind of craving for such a thing. I mean, that's why people who aren't religious at all will go on Christmas Eve and light candles and stand in a church. They might not believe anything. But what are they? And I don't think it's just nostalgia. Maybe some of that is, oh, I remember I did this when I was a kid. I think it's more than that. I think it's like the craving for meaning, for resonance, for the mysterious striking of the tuning fork. Not that it's going to happen, but I think the craving for it. And that's why so much of the consumerism around Christmas holidays doesn't taste very good in our mouths. I think for most people, they're not like really that happy that they got a deal at Walmart, you know? I mean, it's like kind of, but in 3 years or less, they won't even remember what they bought, you know? So I think we share that in common, that kind of, it leaves a bitter taste. And I think the craving for such a thing wakes up. So let me look and see. I had 4 points. One of them was to try to get at this definition. And I put this really long quote from James Hollis's book called The Eden Project, which is definitely worth reading. Search for the Magical Other, and I'll try to refer to it. But something else that I think Hollis says that I think is interesting about our relationship to the spiritual life. He says there are sort of 3 elements to it. One of them I've already named, and we're kind of on the same page about this, me and Hollis. And that is, he says, number 1, a spiritual life has resonance in it. That's actually the same image from the tuning fork. And I am saying you can't manufacture it. Okay? This is why, if you're religious, how many of you, I don't want to like call you out or something, how many of you went through confirmation? Anybody go through confirmation? Okay. I won't ask you this, but we'll just take it as a general possibility. At the end of confirmation, you may not have had that resonance. I'm not against confirmation. That's a whole other conversation. I think something interesting is going on about how one passes on a tradition and why you would want to pass on a tradition. But that's what I mean. It doesn't guarantee resonance. You know? Sometimes it can happen that way, though. We don't know. Like, I don't know if you've ever read Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain. One time he describes, I think, being in Cuba when he kneels down and takes the Eucharist and he has what I would call a spiritual experience. And you could say the Eucharist caused it, but he had taken the Eucharist before. Do you know what I'm saying? So why then? All of a sudden the tuning fork was struck. And it changed his life in that sense. And he began to order his life differently than prior to this event. So number 1, there's resonance. There's some kind of invisible energies, I'm using Hollis's language, between the inner and the outer that is humming. The second element of what he is describing here as the spiritual life, or our relationship to the mystery is another way of putting it, is that there's depth there. So on the one hand, there's resonance. On the other hand, there's depth. What does he say? Whatever pulls us deeper into the greater life or the larger life, there's depth. A spiritual life is not paper thin, is what I think he's trying to say. There's no bottom to it. It's like you fall through a trap door or something like that. There's depth. And the third word he uses to describe a kind of relationship with mystery, I think, is an interesting one. He says it involves some numinosity. Some numinosity. The word numen means to wink, which I think is interesting, right? There's a wink that happens. What's going on with the, okay. Keep up the good work then. Numinosity. This was one of Carl Jung's favorite words for spiritual experiences. The numinous, winking. It's as if the internal winks to the external or the external winks to the internal. Now, let's make this more practical. How many of you have ever read something, listened to a great song, had a dream, we're engaging in a conversation that really had depth and resonance, and then all of a sudden later on that day, you encountered something that surprised you that seemed to like be related to that. Have you ever experienced that? That's the numinous. That's the universe winking at you. That's what it means. It's not exactly saying, I caused this. It's not a causal relationship. It actually seems like a kind of glorious accident. Like you're reading, like you have a dream about an owl. And the owl whispers something in your ear. And then you walk out your front door and there's an owl sitting in the tree. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Yeah, that's the numinous. That's the winking of the universe. And what he's saying is that the spiritual life is open to winking. And occasionally we experience the wink. And it's almost like saying, keep going. Life is more meaningful than you think. It's sort of the feel of it. It doesn't explain things. It's just like a little hint. So to me, there's something about that I enjoy and appreciate. It makes the universe more mysterious, not less. And maybe that's a definition of a cultivation of a spiritual life, falling in love more and more with just the mystery of things. And occasionally you get a wink or a head nod or something like that in a passing moment. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Number two, I want to talk about what we might call the God image. The God image. Because as soon as you start talking about the spiritual life, people start wondering, are we talking about God? And if so, how are we talking about God? What is the relationship between the spiritual life and what we call the divine or God? And how can we have a conversation in the 21st century that's different than the first century? Because times have changed in that respect. And we live in a landscape where religion is cracking and fragmenting and spinning out, and also at other moments becoming even more rigid and solidified and certain, and in some cases dangerous. Wouldn't you agree? So it's hard to talk about God or the God image or something like that. But I want to read part of this quotation again from what I passed out here. Certainly, the grand religious traditions, this is the very beginning of it, have preserved myriad images, some of which still carry the energy of soul for certain individuals. Each of us must sort through the magnificent ruins and find those images that speak to us, those that are personally resonant. So, quick time out here. I think what he's saying, first of all, I liked how he describes the general religious landscape as magnificent ruins. Doesn't it feel that way? Like magnificent ruins. But what he's saying is that we have some responsibility, you can disagree, to sift through these ruins, to see what is still resonant and what is not. And there's no guarantee what might strike you and what, like the tuning fork. It may be completely flat. The religion you may have grown up in may be completely flat, or there may be some hidden resonance in there. You can't predict, is what I'm saying. But to sift through them is to participate in the great conversation that human beings have had around meaning. That's another definition of religion. Like, what is religion? It's the great human conversation that people have tried to have around meaning. And you're not, I know it's fun to think of, but you're not a tabula rasa. You're not a blank slate. You came into this world looking the way you look and having the experiences that you have had, and also the parents and ancestors that you've had, and traditions that you came from, and parts of the world that you came from. Even I can tell from some of your accents that you came from all over the place. Anyway, you come bearing a lot of material. And he's saying, to a certain extent, we have to sift through this stuff, the magnificent ruins, for what is personally resonant. That's a little like what's in our value statements, which is independent, what is it? Independent spiritual journeys. How many of you, at some time in your life, have had to do some sorting and sifting through some magnificent ruins? Okay. What I'm trying to say is, many people think about that as leaving the spiritual life. To some extent, you could say that's starting a spiritual life, really, is that sifting and that sorting, and you don't get to predict what might be personally resonant. But also, you don't have to make it all up. The other thing that we might say about religions in general is that they preserve images or symbols, we could say. And I'm going to make up a scenario. I probably should have thought about this before, but let's just say I was out there on that hill that is now a ski resort, and resort, a place where people go down the hill, a very short hill. And let's just say I had a spiritual experience, whatever it was, and I set up a stone on the top so that I could remember this spiritual experience. And then I started telling you about it, and you're like, oh, we should go see this place. And then we went up there, and you're like, oh, this is the spot where Kent had his spiritual experience. And you might feel some of it there, too. You might be like, oh, yeah, I can see. There's a little resonance here, even for me, even though I didn't have your same experience. And then we might tell the next generation, and they might go up there, too, correct? They might say, oh, that's where Kent, now that he's dead, that guy that somebody told us about had this spiritual experience. And they might tell their grandkids, but after a while, they might forget, correct? Or they might build an entire building around the stone that I set up to tell people about my experience, correct? Have you seen these buildings? I'd like to say there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of the human motivation to be in conversation with the sacred, with the mystery, with the divine, with the numinous, with the winking, so forth and so on. But it doesn't manufacture it, because you can walk into that building now that's up on top of the hill, built on the stone that Kent once had an experience, and feel nothing, correct? So there you are. You have to sift through the magnificent ruins. And then probably my great-great-grandkids are going to go over to a different hill, and they're going to have an experience, and they're going to say, actually, it was on this hill, and the whole cycle will start over again. That's my summary of religion in 6 minutes. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with this, human propensity to have conversations around this. I want to read something else that's down here at the bottom. So the third paragraph. As we know, images express the deep movement of the soul. Images that express the deep movement of the soul can, what's that word? Also reify. I know what it means, I just can't say it. Grow brittle or even die. Agreed? Yes. We need to remember that the image is not the God. The image is not the God. Even the stone that I set up on the hill over there is not the God. It simply points to the mysterious experience, correct? So he goes on. It is the vehicle of the godly. We need to remember, it seems the common temptation of us all is to adore the image rather than the mystery to which it points. And thus, again, the state of affairs in much of the religious landscape of the West, and probably the East too, but I can't speak for that. I don't know. We tend to bow down before the image, not the mystery to which it points. So part of the sifting through the magnificent ruins is we need to hear that. That's what the Bible calls idolatry. That's what I think it's in the 10 Commandments. Don't do it, it says. Don't set up an image, because you will bow down before the image. You'll forget that the image is simply a symbol of something you cannot name that winks at you occasionally. Do you get what I'm saying? And I think every year at Christmas time, we come back around to this question. I saw a manger scene at my friend's house that had, this is so good. the little baby, Mary holding a Starbucks cup, and Joseph taking a selfie of the three of them. Yes, the wise men were carrying packages from Amazon, and the shepherds were on their headphones. Okay? That's some good stuff right there. Why would somebody make that? Because I'm telling you, the tension between, is there any mystery in this universe, or is it all consumption? Even our spiritual, religious experiences we consume now. That ought to bother us. But I think drive us toward the question of, what is a spiritual life? Do I want one? Have I had any numinous experiences in my life? If so, can I begin, which many of you are, I know, because I know you a little bit, what if I ordered my life around these things and started desiring and pursuing meaning rather than just, I don't know, some alternative? Like, wouldn't it be awesome to get a selfie with me and baby Jesus, you know? Think about that. That's so good. I guarantee you, if you were there, you'd be like, we should get a selfie. I mean, let's just be honest. This would be Instagrammable, you know? Me and the king, you know? It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. So good. So, one of my questions to you is this. First of all, here's an assumption. I think your soul has a kind of intelligence to it. It's shaped a certain way. And one of the questions is, what rings my bell? That's back to the tuning fork. What rings it? Really, what rings it? It doesn't have to fit into any particular norm, religious or non-religious. What rings your bell? And what if you begin to order your life that way? I thought of some stories about kind of the soul's intelligence, this tuning fork, the spiritual life. Here are people I thought of. St. Francis, I don't know if you've ever heard the story. He's praying in this ruined chapel in Assisi. And he looks up at this cross, which is still there in Assisi, and it rings his bell. We know that because he describes it. He doesn't say, it rang my bell, but that's what happens. And he hears something like, rebuild my church. And he takes it literally and starts putting stones back together, and it changes his life. So that's a sort of sanctified version. Here's another one I thought of. So imagine Darwin is out there on his little ship, and he's visiting these islands. And he has, in my view, something like a winking, an encounter with mystery, and he begins to notice that the beaks of birds are different on different islands. And it so strikes him, sort of to his core, that he orders the rest of his life around this insight. Wouldn't you agree? And he gives us, I wouldn't even call it the theory of origin of the species or evolution. I think he experiences reality in a mysterious way and then begins to try to make sense of it. Correct? That's an example, I think, of a spiritual life. And by the way, if you read The Origin of the Species, that's the way he talks about it. I know people like to turn him into some, like the first atheist, but that's not how he talks about himself. He talks about this as a profound spiritual experience, because that's probably what it was. Or Einstein, who I mentioned this before, said how he came up with the theory of relativity was in his imagination. And then he began to put words around it. That's the mysterious. That's bumping into the mysterious and then beginning to order your life around such meaning. Make sense? Let's see if I thought of other ones. I guess I just wanted to expand the notion of where you might encounter mystery. Could be in the ruined chapel like St. Francis, or it could be images from the Hubble Space Telescope. One time I was watching the History Channel, and I nearly had an existential crisis because they were showing what the stars look like. Like, what is this place, really? Like, who am I? And what where is the meaning? That's a kind of bumping into something larger, which is another way of describing the spiritual life. Bumping into the mysterious, some larger reality, or DNA strands for that matter, if you want to go all the way down to the small. What are these things? Where might you encounter the mysterious? I saw an article in CNN as I was feeding my phone addiction. And in this, there was a story about someone who was really into the Shroud of Turin. You can see I'm not that into it. And she said something that struck me as the kind of thing I'm talking about. She was saying when she was in college or something like this, she went to see it. She had never heard of it, didn't know what it was, and it so struck her that she became a scholar of this pursuit. That's what I'm saying. You couldn't predict it. It was an encounter with something larger, like a mystery, and she began to order her life around it. It doesn't matter whether or not it is the cloth they wrap Jesus in. It's just something about it is resonant. The pursuit of mystery. Do you hear what I'm saying? So again, my question is, what is numinous for you? What rings your bell? You could even start with what has rung my bell and what's ringing my bell now. Those might be different things, correct? Because you are on an independent spiritual journey that has twists and turns and a few dead ends, hopefully not too many. But fine, you get to one, you just turn around and go back the other way. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what a gift. And this is my final point, because I see I'm running out of time. I think we have a kind of wild opportunity in the 20th and 21st century that human beings haven't had, which is a kind of freedom to pursue such things that, for whatever reason, culture, politics, religious tradition, language, ethnicity, tried to contain in very small boxes. That's most of human history. Most of human history, you really didn't have the kind of freedoms you have now, even to say to your parents, I'm not going to your church anymore. Nobody heard of such a thing, honestly, or barely heard of such a thing. Those people who broke, we now read about in books like Jesus or Buddha or St. Francis, now that I think of it. Wealthy family, dad's a merchant, says, I'd rather wear just sacks. I don't want any of this stuff, And now we read about him, and now we put him in little gardens, which I'm sure he loves. Anyway. My main point was, what an opportunity we have to pursue the spiritual life in a wildly independent way that is still in conversation with where we came from. And I think there's a tension. The tension looks something like there's a public and private tension or conversation that's happening. What kind of path am I on? How is that related to the great traditions? How is that related to my neighbor's path? This is where lively and life-giving conversation can unfold, not just rigid ideologies and hatred. But I think it requires something of us, a kind of humility. Maybe I'm really preaching to myself, a kind of humility. All right, it's just my experience. Can I get honest about it? Can I try to name it? Can I see how it relates to others? Can I see how it might be related to the magnificent ruins that I'm sifting through? And just to begin to talk about that story. Because wouldn't you want to live a life in pursuit of more meaning, not less? Then you want a spiritual life. That's all I got to say today. Thanks.